Welcome back. Remember, today we're looking at the human skeleton. Now, we're going to spend this segment familiarizing yourselves with the whole compact skeleton. It might be fun for you to find a partner, and as we talk about the different bones, see if you can find these bones on your partner or on yourself as we work through the names of the different bones. Next week, we're going to carefully go through what we call the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton, and we're going to look at the functions and the structures of these two different parts of the skeleton in detail. But let's just spend some time familiarizing ourselves with all of these names. I think that very often learners find it very difficult to get to grips with these strange names. We know that this is your head, so why on earth call it something else? Well, you need to become familiar with the names of the parts of the skeleton. So let's look at this picture, and we can see that the picture is colored in two different tones to provide us with a little bit of insight that although we have one skeleton, we divide it into two parts, what we call the axial skeleton, which comes from the word axis, which means running down the central core of your body, and the appendicular skeleton, which is things attached to or hanging from the axial skeleton. I think you can very clearly see here that the parts of the skeleton showing in green are in fact the axial skeleton. The parts in purple are the appendicular skeleton, hanging from that central structure. And so, starting at the top, of course, that entire brain case of yours is known as the cranium. You can also quite correctly call it your skull. All right, so the skull or the cranium is what encloses the brain and your very important sense organs such as your eyes, your sense of hearing, smell and taste. That brain box or cranium is not one bone. Next week when we have a look at the skull in detail, you'll see that it's made up of many different bones that are fused together. However, we're not going to worry about all the different parts of the skull, except for you to remember that only one of those many bones that makes up the cranium is movable, and that's your lower jaw. All right, so your mandible or your lower jaw is the only bone that moves or that is obvious that it moves inside or attached to your skull. All right, moving down, if we had a look, that was our cranium, we can see, of course, what makes us vertebrates. This structure called the vertebral column. I think when you were younger, you probably referred to it as the backbone. And I want you to right now stop referring to it as a backbone, because if you call it a backbone, it implies that there's only one bone down the center of your back, and that is not true. The backbone or vertebral column consists of many, many bones that articulate together so that you can move, and you can move forward, you can move sideways off that column, and that's all brought about by many bones placed one on top of the other with just a little bit of flexibility between the bones, and that allows a limited but significant form of movement. It becomes limited if you just look at the amount of movement between two of those bones, but significant when you place, say, 10 of those bones together. You can get a fairly significant degree of movement taking place. And just as the skull protected the brain, the vertebral column protects the spinal cord. Later on in the program, we're going to be looking at the nervous system, and you're going to just see how so important those two structures are to the control and response to stimuli from the outside of the body. And so they have to be very well protected. Attached to the vertebral column are, of course, the ribs. And next week we'll see exactly how the ribs are attached. They're attached at the back to the vertebral column, and they're attached at the front to this structure here, which we call the sternum, which is also known as your breastbone. And the ribs are attached in a fairly flexible way that they allow for breathing to take place. In fact, the ribs are what move upwards and outwards, creating a negative pressure inside your chest so that air is sucked in. So these ribs are very, very important, not only for protection, but in actually allowing you to breathe. Everything else is kind of suspended or hung from this central axial skeleton. You'll see that we've got the two upper limbs, your two arms, and your two legs, and they're attached, the legs, to what we call the pelvic girdle, and your arms to something called a pectoral girdle. And next week we're going to look at those in a lot more detail. Try and find a picture like this in your textbook and start practicing getting your mouth around those words. Try and identify where the bones are on your body and maybe with a partner, and see if you can cover up the labels of the diagram and give yourself a little test in order to spell those words correctly and to be able to pronounce them correctly. But we're going to look at the skeleton in far more detail next week. So grade 10s and 11s, you need to join me then next week because we're going to focus on that in more detail. After the break, grade 12s, you need to get yourselves ready because we're going to be introducing the nervous system. So I'll see you after the break.